To understand the Second World War, we must travel back to the end of World War I. In 1919, the victorious nations signed the Treaty of Versailles. Its harsh terms on Germany, forced to accept blame and pay reparations, planted seeds of resentment. The treaty redrew Europe's map, creating instability. The Great Depression swept the world, causing job losses and despair. People turned to strong leaders promising national pride and economic strength. The League of Nations was too weak to stop aggressive countries. The world was filled with anger and fear. All it needed was a spark. Leaders emerged believing in power and conquest. The stage was set for an even more devastating conflict. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rose to power as leader of the Nazi Party. He promised to rebuild Germany's military and restore the nation. He blamed others, particularly Jewish people, for Germany's problems. Hitler became Germany's chancellor in 1933, turning the country into a totalitarian state. In Italy, Benito Mussolini seized control, promising to restore the glory of the ancient Roman Empire. Mussolini's Italy became an inspiration for Hitler, and the two dictators formed a close alliance. In the Pacific, the Empire of Japan had its own grand ambitions, lacking natural resources. Its leaders believed it was Japan's destiny to create a vast empire across Asia and the Pacific. Germany, Italy, and Japan would soon form a military alliance known as the Axis powers. As Hitler rearmed Germany, Mussolini dreamed of a new Roman Empire, and Japan carved a bloody path through China. The world watched with growing fear. The shadow of dictatorship was spreading, and the march to war seemed unstoppable. On September 1, 1939, the world held its breath. Under the gray light of dawn, Hitler's armies stormed across the border into Poland. This was not a slow, grinding invasion like those of World War I. This was something new, something terrifyingly fast and destructive. It was called Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war. The strategy was designed to create shock and paralysis, to overwhelm an enemy so quickly that they had no time to mount a proper defense. It was a brutal symphony of modern military power, combining air power, tanks, and infantry in a single devastating thrust. The invasion of Poland marked the official beginning of World War II in Europe. The Blitzkrieg tactic worked with horrifying efficiency. First, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, screamed out of the sky. Stuka dive bombers with their terrifying sirens targeted airfields, communication centers, and railway lines, cutting off the Polish army from its supplies and leadership. They created chaos and terror among soldiers and civilians alike. Immediately following the air attacks came the tanks, the mighty panzers. They didn't spread out but concentrated their force, punching holes deep into the Polish defensive lines, racing ahead and encircling entire enemy armies before they even knew what was happening. This was the steel fist of the German war machine. Following closely behind the tanks were the motorized infantry, soldiers in trucks and on motorcycles who could keep pace with the panzers. Their job was to mop up any remaining resistance and secure the territory the tanks had conquered. This combination of air power, armor, and infantry was perfectly coordinated by radio, another key innovation. Commanders could direct the battle in real time, exploiting weaknesses and redirecting their forces with incredible speed. Poland, despite its brave resistance, was simply overwhelmed. Its army, which still relied heavily on cavalry, was no match for this modern mechanized onslaught. Within weeks, the country was crushed. The success of the Blitzkrieg in Poland sent a shockwave across the globe. Britain and France, who had pledged to protect Poland, declared war on Germany, but they were too far away and too slow to help. The lightning war strategy was later used to conquer Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and most shockingly, France in 1940. The speed and ferocity of the German advance seemed unstoppable. Blitzkrieg was more than just a military tactic, it was a psychological weapon. It was designed to shatter an enemy's will to fight, to prove that resistance was futile. It was the tool that allowed Hitler to become the master of most of continental Europe in less than a year. The conflict that began in Poland quickly grew into a global war, dividing the world into the Axis powers and the Allied powers. The Axis, led by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, aimed to destroy the existing world order. Their ideologies were built on aggression and nationalism. The main allies were Great Britain and France, later joined by a vast coalition. Key leaders included Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, united against a common enemy. The war was fought across multiple theaters from Europe and North Africa to Asia and the Pacific. It was a total war, involving entire societies with factories converted for war production and civilians mobilized. The world became a single battlefield, a fight between freedom and tyranny. On December 7, 1941, the United States was at peace. But a Japanese naval fleet was approaching Pearl Harbor. Japanese leadership believed the U.S. could stop its expansion in Asia. They launched a surprise attack to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet. As Japanese planes approached Oahu, American sailors were beginning their Sunday. Suddenly, the sky was filled with explosions. Hundreds of Japanese planes descended on Pearl Harbor, targeting battleships and airfields. The attack was a stunning success. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese had sunk or damaged numerous ships, destroyed aircraft, and killed thousands. The attack was a profound shock to the American people, shattering isolationism. President Roosevelt declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan. This changed the course of World War II. The United States was now fully engaged in the global conflict. It awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with resolve. The industrial might of the U.S. was committed to the Allied cause. By 1944, the Allies needed to open a major new front in Western Europe. They had to launch an invasion across the English Channel and land on the beaches of France. This operation was codenamed Operation Overlord. The day of the invasion was known as D-Day. It would be the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. On June 6, 1944, the invasion began. Thousands of paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines in Normandy. As the sun rose, a colossal Allied fleet appeared off the coast and began a naval bombardment. The landings were a brutal and bloody affair. By the end of that day, the Allies had successfully landed over 156,000 troops in Normandy. D-Day was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany and opened the door to the liberation of France. Amid the clash of armies and the thunder of battles, one of the most horrific events in human history was taking place in secret. It is known as the Holocaust. This was not a battle, but a systematic, state-sponsored genocide. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime believed that Germans were a superior Aryan race and that Jewish people were inferior and a threat to German purity and strength. This deep-seated hatred, known as anti-Semitism, was a core part of Nazi ideology. Using this poisonous belief, the Nazis planned the deliberate murder of all the Jewish people in Europe, what they chillingly called the final solution. The persecution began as soon as the Nazis came to power. They passed laws that stripped Jewish people of their citizenship, their jobs, and their property. They were forbidden from public spaces, forced to wear a yellow Star of David to identify them, and subjected to constant humiliation and violence. In 1938, during a night of terror called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, Nazi mobs destroyed Jewish synagogues and businesses across Germany. As Germany conquered more of Europe, millions more Jewish people came under their brutal control. They were rounded up and forced into overcrowded, sealed-off neighborhoods called ghettos, where starvation and disease were rampant. The final, most terrible stage of the Holocaust was the creation of a network of concentration camps and extermination camps. People were transported to these camps in horrific conditions, crammed into cattle cars for days without food or water. At camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor, the Nazis built gas chambers designed for mass murder. Upon arrival, many people, especially the old, the sick, and young children, were sent directly to their deaths. Those deemed fit enough to work were forced into slave labor, where they were starved, beaten, and worked to death. It was a factory system designed not to produce goods, but to produce death on an industrial scale. By the end of the war in 1945, the Nazis had murdered 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. They also targeted and murdered millions of other people they considered undesirable, including Roma, homosexuals, disabled people, and political opponents. When Allied soldiers liberated the camps, they were confronted with scenes of unimaginable horror. Piles of bodies, emaciated survivors, and the cold, hard evidence of industrial-scale murder. The Holocaust stands as a stark and terrible warning of where hatred, prejudice, and indifference can lead. It is a memory we must preserve, a solemn promise to never forget and to never allow such an atrocity to happen again. As the war in Europe ended, the fight in the Pacific raged on. The Empire of Japan refused to surrender, fighting with fanatical devotion. American planners predicted a bloody invasion of Japan. President Truman faced a terrible choice. He had a new secret weapon, the atomic bomb. It was the result of the Manhattan Project, where scientists unlocked the power of the atom. Truman decided to use the bomb to force Japan's surrender and save lives. On August 6, the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city was destroyed, and tens of thousands were killed. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Faced with this power and the Soviet Union's declaration of war, Emperor Hirohito surrendered. This day became VJ Day. The use of atomic bombs brought World War II to an end, ushering in the atomic age. The end of the war brought relief and joy. But this victory came at a staggering cost. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. The world that emerged was very different. Determined not to repeat the past, leaders created the United Nations to promote peace and security. The Nuremberg trials established that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. Two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their ideological differences led to the Cold War, a long period of tension. The legacy of World War II is far-reaching, sparking movements for civil rights and decolonization. The greatest tribute we can pay to that generation is to strive for a world where such a devastating conflict can never happen again.